workers, provide safe and healthy workplaces, end gender violence and discrimination against racial, ethnic minorities, and to empower workers at the base. This is a huge goal, but one we must take on with commitment and creativity and resolve. So today we'll be exploring these conversations, and I'm so pleased to introduce the session's moderator, Kate Monahan, who is the Shareholder Engagement Manager at Friends Fiduciary Corporation and part of the Human Trafficking Worker Rights leadership team. So Kate will be introducing our remarkable panelists who are dear friends of ICCR. So Kate, please take it away.
Thank you, David. And first, a huge thank you to David for organizing this. And also a huge thank you to our amazing group of panelists that we are so lucky to have today. Before I introduce them, I wanted to highlight a couple of quick housekeeping items. So first, we invite you to ask questions throughout the discussion in the chat box, and that should be at the bottom of your screen. Excuse me, we may not have enough time to answer every question during the Q&A session at the end, but we will get through as many as we can. And the second housekeeping item is that this is obviously such a rich topic with panelists whose work is so fascinating. And I know that we're going to have a really generative discussion, but we also have so much to fit into an hour, so I may just have to intervene to make sure that we get to everything that we need to. But now I will briefly introduce our panelists and turn it over to them to introduce themselves and their organizations and where in the supply chain their organization's work is focused. So we have Bobby Santamaria, who's the Deputy Director for Strategy and Partnerships at Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. We also have Nina Smith, Founding Chief Executive Officer of Goodweave International, and Gerardo Reyes Chavez, who's with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. So now I will hand it first over to Nina. So go right ahead, thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I also want to thank ICCR and David for having me join the panel. We've been longtime partners, so it's great to be here. And I think we were going to get a slide up right now. So Goodweave works to end child labor in global supply chains around the world. And we're known for our label, the Goodweave label, which is an individually numbered traceable label found on the back of carpets and home textile goods that can be traceable back to the origins of where the product was made. And our model focuses on a few things. One, bringing visibility into the supply chains. And David talked about the workers at the base. And so really what we do is to try to get to that base, really what we call the hidden supply chains, where there are informal workers toiling in the supply chain, but often not touched by traditional supply chain programs. And when we get in deep into the supply chain, that's where we find the majority of abuse of child labor, forced labor, other forms of labor exploitation, and then we work to stop that exploitation and ensure remedy. And finally, the organization works through our local organizations on the ground in South Asia on addressing the root causes of child labor and forced labor. And I'll just say that our model is a market-driven model. We work with companies to drive this change. We have over 180 corporate partners around the world that are working with us on this mission. We've rescued more than 7,600 children, 7,600 children directly. And in the carpet industry where we began our work 25 years ago, we've seen a reduction of child labor by 2/3 in South Asia in the carpet industry. We're now working in home textiles. We have a program in apparel, and we also have a capacity building division of the organization that helps to spread the methodologies of what we're doing. And I also also just one more point I wanted to make is it was through ICCR probably about 15 years ago now that we signed our first big corporate partner, Macy's, way back when with David and many others that helped us to make that a reality. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nina. I'll turn it over to Bobby now.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone, and also thank you to ICCR for holding space and giving space to our organization, which is very new, and the work of our allies to speak about what we've been trying to build. And thank you to all of you for showing up this afternoon. It's the first step towards us working together. So I work for a newly merged organization called, by its two names combined, Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. The International Labor Rights Forum had its beginnings in the 90s as a progressive coalition of labor rights, human rights, faith, and policy leaders that were seeking to mitigate the harm of economic globalization on workers. So what ILRF has done was lead several campaigns to secure labor rights protections in US trade agreements. And these are mechanisms that we continue to use in order to demand stringent accountability from US market actors. So a recent example would be a petition that we brought under the Tariff Act for the US Customs and Border Protection to issue orders banning some cotton and other products from the Uyghur region in China for forced labor linked to systemic abuses against the Uyghur and Turkmenic peoples. And the other half, Global Labor Justice, was created in 2017 by a set of organizers, movement lawyers based in Asia, the US, and Latin America. And it kind of like expands that work by confronting the altered terrain that's characterized by even greater movement of goods, greater movement of people, and pairing that with legal policy and research, along with organizing across the global supply chain lines, whether between producing and purchasing countries, along migration corridors. And so as a merged organization, what we try to do is we try to bring strategic capacity to transnational organizing efforts. So what that would look like would be supporting with research, legal analyses, legal strategies, not just along purchasing supply lines, but also looking at global financialization, looking at labor migration. We work in a bunch of sectors. In Asia, we are closely working with the Asia Floor Wage Alliance and currently monitoring the impacts of the pandemic on workers, especially women workers, and developing analyses and demands that we have started to bring into brand negotiations and campaigning. And then outside of garments, we also work, just to give another example, with hospitality workers in Chile, for example, that are seeking re-employment after COVID layoffs and trying to build broad solidarity with fellow workers outside of Chile, in North America. So that's the new thing that we're trying to bring. Like, how do we support or how do we bridge national and regional worker movements around organizing, but also through strength in research and legal and campaigning strategies.
Great, thank you so much, Bobby. And now Gerardo. I think you are muted, Gerardo.
My God. It couldn't be a panel without technical difficulties. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and you know, we have been fighting for decades to be able to build a system that can change, that can challenge the status quo in agriculture. And in 2011, we were able to land something that had no precedent, something that we call the Fair Food Program. Now, what the Fair Food Program is, and the reason why it happened, is because it centers into something really important to be able to affect change, which is to build power. At the end of the day, many of the abuses that happen in this industry and many others happen because of the lack of power that workers have, lack of protections, and lack of commitment on behalf of corporations that buy tomatoes in huge amounts. And with that, they exercise their influence, driving prices down. Workers end up receiving wages that have been stagnant for more than 3 decades. In 2011, we started to change that by bringing 14 corporations, including Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, even Walmart. There's 14 in total. They represent about 20% of the market. And when they say we are joining onto this program and legally, through legally binding agreements, we are going to conduct our business buying from farms that are willing to respect the workers and their rights. There was a code of conduct that was created by workers themselves, and there is the market consequences, which means there are abuses that are zero tolerance, like modern day slavery, sexual assault, child labor. All of those are included on this list of rights that we as workers now have. And what that means is a clear commitment that comes from these corporations that have signed to basically direct their purchases where these things are happening, creating a huge incentive that is worth millions, and that in return, it creates the protections that the workers need to be able to exercise their power inside these operations. What that has translated into is a transformation of conditions, elimination and prevention, not just identification of problems, but identification and prevention and elimination of the problems that I mentioned before that are the worst of all, which are sexual assault. There hasn't been cases of sexual assault. We have reduced the nature, changed the nature of sexual harassment because of the consequences. Crew leaders have been fired, supervisors have been fired for committing these kinds of abuses and crimes, and is not tolerated anymore. And we have been able to stop modern day slavery in its tracks. That is what we call the worker-driven social responsibility model. The components that makes it work, the workers at the center, the market consequences, the legally binding agreements, both from the market and from the grower side, and the effective overseeing through the Fair Food Standards Council, which is tasked with the job of overseeing compliance, both levels, and receiving complaints, bringing them to a resolution. Concretely, what this Fair Food program and WSR model brings is an opportunity for other sectors to also aim at implementing something that can be adapted to the reality. And that's something that we have seen. We have been working with migrant justice in the dairy industry. They create something they call the Meal with Dignity program, which is functioning right now with the participation of a corporation right now is participating, Ben & Jerry's, and they are asking Hannaford to also join and others. So this is the model. We're really excited. It is also being implemented in the construction in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, through the organization called SETU. And we're collaborating with organizations that are aiming to also land similar approaches of WSR through the partnership we have with Ben Seremos. They are aiming to become a practitioner eventually, and they are fighting for the rights in the poultry industry. Tomorrow you'll hear more about them. So I'll just give you a little piece.
Great, thank you so much, Gerardo. And thank you everyone for that great overview of your work. And now we are going to move into the panel discussion. So we'll start right off. Our first question is, what do you see as the top weaknesses in the current supply chain system? So I'll hand it over to Nina.
Thanks, Kate, for the question. There's so many, but I'm going to focus on, I think one of the big weaknesses is that when it comes to companies addressing, ensuring real labor rights, traditionally there's been a focus on, I would say, legal compliance and not really, I mean, Gerardo talked about it well, like worker-centered, ground level assurance of rights, protection of rights of workers. And so, you know, there's a real gap there. And one of the things, you know, I wanted to especially highlight is the huge investments that are being made in the supply chains by companies. I recently shared some research by a donor who has estimated about $2 billion a year being invested in CSR programs, with perhaps about 500 million going into labor rights programs. But there's a huge gap in terms of where those funds are invested and where they're needed when we're talking about human rights issues. And so I think that's something we really need to look at. And my opening slide showed I failed to really describe it in detail, but it showed how complex supply chains are, at least when we're talking about manufacturing, that most companies, for example, will do an audit in a factory, which we'd call a tier 1 or a primary factory location. But there is a huge amount of their production happening outside of those factory walls by informal workers. And to give you an example, there's a big company we work with. When we first started working with them, they kind of said, we have all these problems. We have child labor and forced labor and modern slavery under control. We have our own people. They audit our factories, but still we're going to work with you. This is a great program. You're investing in the ground into worker communities. And when our ground teams that are embedded in the communities where the products are being made started doing their work, they found almost 900 subcontractor units under these 5 factories. So there's a widespread informal work involved in the global economy that is not being accounted for. And if we don't reach these places, then we are not addressing these massive human rights violations. And specifically when it comes to our work, we're talking about child labor, forced labor, bonded labor, especially. Although we do work on some of the other issues, that's really the heart of it. And that's where the problem is. So we have to close the gap in terms of where there are being investments made in this work and where they're badly needed. And then once we can build the visibility into this deep supply chain, then we have to ensure remedy for workers who are being exploited there and tackle what's causing some of these issues to begin with. And again, in the case of Goodweave, in addition to direct remediation for workers, we're also implementing community-based programs focused on ensuring all children are going to school in the producer communities, health, safety, wage programs for adult workers. So it's very holistic. And I just think we have to move away from this checkbox legal compliance. I mean, we all know that sitting in this room on this panel. But how you do it is essential, and one of the avenues is going deep and getting to where the problem is and just doing that hard work. I'll leave it there.
Bobby, do you want to take it next?
Yeah. So our core analysis around weaknesses in supply chains could really be described as just the great inequality in risk distribution. The global supply chain is designed to protect those at the top of the chain from industrial uncertainty, from market uncertainties, and those at the bottom, which are the workers, and down to the subcontractors and their workers. They're the ones that absorb this risk. And I think the most practical way of understanding that risk distribution is by looking at purchasing practices, where there are flexible terms in terms of the way that, let's say in the garment sector, in the way that brands source their goods from factories. It's characterized by a lot of flexibility in terms of when they pay, how quick the turnaround times are, how quickly they can change designs and patterns, etc., and how this translates to workers is that they would then have to take up flexible work contracts. They would then have to have periods of unemployment when there is a decrease in demand, and they would then have to bear very low wages because the pricing is completely controlled by those at the top in such a way that protects them. So what we see as what we have seen happen is that the pandemic is just exposing all of this, and we describe the effect on workers as some sort of humanitarian crisis, and we see it really as a predictable outcome of that structure of risk distribution that has characterized those supply chains. So we are in a situation where, predating the pandemic, workers have lived from paycheck to paycheck without access to healthcare and social protections. And the lead firms and the brands have reaped financial benefits from this kind of system and are also sidestepping contributions to national social protections that are supposed to shield workers from these risks. So again, the pandemic just demonstrates that the low wages are insufficient to build resiliency in the face of a social crisis, and that that these lead firms have even more flexibility to cancel orders, to shift suppliers, which even means like less employment opportunities for workers. And just going into that, we have seen that one of the central campaign pieces around garment supply chains has been around how brands are disengaging from business relationships and in purchasing, such that if not for strong campaigning, brands would have gotten away with canceling orders that are already existing. So it's another manifestation of that kind of low risk that they have, that translates to how they're just able to shift terms at will, basically. And yeah, and I could get more into what proposals are in place, but yeah, I think that pretty much captures our analysis around what we think are the core weaknesses of supply chains.
Thanks so much, Bobby. And passing it on to Gerardo.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that in analyzing, how the corporate world operates, I think that one of their biggest weaknesses is to fail to recognize the creativity, knowledge, expertise that comes from communities that are suffering at the bottom of their supply chain. Because, plans are crafted, issues are talked about by different actors, by different people that are worried about the conditions that we face. And, it's not that it's a matter of ignorance. I think it's a matter of indifference that bring corporations to try to shut down efforts that empower workers so that they don't have to give up their dignity. That's what needs to change, because they are looking at this on the wrong way. What corporations should be looking at is how is it that this program is able to deliver with in measurable forms a guarantee for our consumers that the produce we are bringing from Florida and other states up the East Coast where we work is produced under conditions that guarantee the elimination of all of these abuses that I was mentioning. They treat issues of human rights abuses as if it is a matter that can be solved by a PR approach. That needs to stop. Our humanity is lost in the middle of those conversations. We are relegated to the side. We become at best a subject of a conversation, but not in any form or meaningful way the creators of the solution. And the reality is that we have more experience than anybody else in the same way the communities that suffer in the supply chain have. It's just that we have not been consulted. We have not been invited to the table. And that's why it makes me think of the words of Frederick Douglass when he said that power consists nothing without a demand. This is a matter of power. And we need to find ways to increase power for the communities that are most vulnerable, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of efforts we are pushing for. If we are not bringing the communities to the center of these conversations, we are failing to be able to address the issues that they see most important. The opportunity I see, I don't want to focus only on weaknesses. The opportunity I see is today we have 20% of the market, 14 corporations. We need a few more to be able to shake the entire foundation of the retail industry, the retail food industry in this country, to be able to expand these protections to workers outside of the states in which we are implementing currently. And finally, I would say consumers, we need to also be able to see, we need to also recognize our weaknesses. And when we fail to do our work, to analyze what's actually working and dedicate time, resources to support these initiatives, when we clearly see that workers are telling you it works and it must be expanded, then we're falling short too. We cannot go with a narrative of something is better than nothing any longer. We have a solution that works in the fields. It's being implemented in different sectors, including the textile industry in Bangladesh and Lesotho, some provisions of what we have. So I think it is time to work together to let our voices be heard about the solutions that can be replicated and start working together on that.
Thanks so much. And I think, all of you have touched a little bit on kind of what the solutions are, but I think Gerardo, as you just were mentioning, it's really workers at the center. And I'm curious, Bobby and Nina, kind of what implementation strategies you think that we need to achieve this transformation?
Not sure if Nina wanted
Go
to.
ahead, Bobby, sorry.
Okay, yeah, sure. So just picking up on what Gerardo said, I totally agree that worker experiences matter in the way that we design responses to the pandemic and beyond, and not just taking into account worker experiences, but being accountable to the workers and ensuring pathways of redress in cases where workers are failed. But just breaking down our recommendations linked to the pandemic and beyond. And these are demands and analyses that our allied organizations, a lot of our partners have been working through over the past months. We wanted to make sure that humanitarian responses are not forgotten, that the immediate needs of workers are responded to, and there are very concrete recommendations out there. For example, paying in full for orders that have been completed or that are in production, contributing to supply chain relief based on a portion of sales of these lead brands, and also, and still linked to worker engagement, addressing the terms of layoffs, of any future downsizing, or the terms of rehiring in a way that engages workers in tripartite negotiations, including the suppliers and the lead firms, but also workers. We have seen how this opportunity to retrench has been used to target union leaders, for example. And we're also seeing how, as companies enter into a phase of having to rehire workers, the union leaders and the organized workers are the last to be rehired, and in favor of younger, less threatening workers. So, like, in terms of being able to set those terms, the piece on community worker engagement also becomes very important. But in terms of the component beyond humanitarian, one of the key proposals that has been put out there and that we will hear more about in the coming days and weeks is how to work towards better social protection floors in producing countries. And from us as an organization, we also wanted to start from a place that companies already understand, like companies already know the language of due diligence. We want to assert that due diligence for human rights impacts covers wage losses, like that not being able to feed one's family because of lost income during a pandemic that's driven by purchasing practices of companies is a type of human rights impact that has to be prevented, that has to be addressed, that has to be mitigated. These are all models that companies have said they are already applying, but it's expanding the view to include that kind of impact on workers, the real impact on workers and families, is to us also an important step that companies should take.
Yeah, and Kate, I don't want to repeat because Gerardo and Bobby talked about, the majority of the fundamental issues here, but I do want to add when it comes to implementation, I think you're asking the question of how, and there isn't a single answer for every, it's not one answer for every region of the world and every sector in the world that's touched by human rights abuses. In terms of directly how to implement, it's one thing I would say is that's kind of been embedded in all of what we're talking about too, is to make sure to have the right partners in addition to having the right criteria, the right legal agreements. I mean, in the end, being on the ground and making sure workers are at the center, making sure we have community-based solutions is essential. And for companies who are sourcing products and who, for all the reasons Bobby mentioned about purchasing practices, there's fast order turnaround, there's all this stuff going on that makes it difficult to work alone. You have to, especially in the informal supply chain that I've been talking about, you have to have ground partners that are based in the communities that can help ensure and facilitate all of this. So, I saw one of the attendees in the audience ask the question of how do brands stop the outsourcing from happening in the supply chains? I mean, our response would be, don't stop it. Those workers should be embraced as a part of the value chain, and they should have proper agreements in place. Their families do need to be provided for, both by the governments and by the fair wages that their parents are being paid. Children should not be working because their parents are being paid living wages, et cetera. So, but how do you verify all of that as a big brand in New York or Minneapolis? I think is critical to have the right partners, be it CIW or Goodweave, but there is not a one size fits all.
Thanks, Nina. And I'm wondering, so we have about 3 minutes before we move into the Q&A session. So Gerardo, I want to give you a chance to kind of speak to the kind of implementation strategies that you think we need. And I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit earlier, but also, I mean, obviously you alluded to this, coalition of Immokalee workers. Obviously that's a successful model, and in Bangladesh. And I'm, curious if what you see as the, if you could talk a little bit more about those successful models and what you think is successful about them, and how they are sort of changing that power dynamic.
Sure. The reason why this model works for us is because, we started to analyze the market, and we realized that huge corporations use their power to drive prices down. That's one of the main things that is connected to our reality, perpetuating poverty for decades. Their growth is correlated with the power they exercise, and it was constantly growing. When you bring corporations through the power of uniting on the streets, because we had to do a national campaign for fair food for many, many years. After about a decade of trying to convince the growers to come to the table, we realized that the way in which they were going to come to the table was to bring the buyers of their produce to say, we're going to buy only if these requirements are met. And the requirements were the list of rights created by the workers. The concrete results up to today, since 2011 until today, corporations pay a little premium that translates into a bonus that is distributed to workers at the end of the week. I'm not going to get into the details, but since 2011 until today, more than $35 million have been distributed among workers in 7 states. We recently expanded to 2 other states. So we have a footprint in 9 states where we are implementing the Fair Food Program. That means that workers are protected when they complain, and they are not going to be fired like they used to before, or victims of violence for speaking up. And that has led to the receiving of 2,800 complaints that in the process of investigating and resolving them by the Fair Food Standards Council, which is the organization that was created to oversee the implementation and compliance, this is something that brings about this transformation. And I mean, we have seen it at work. I would end up by saying, you know, when you think about what works, it's important to also note what doesn't. And that's very important. So I'm going to put a link to something that is called the MSI Integrity Report. It's a research of 10 years by Harvard Law School. And they have been focusing on understanding how the multi-stakeholder initiatives operate, what are their shortcomings. And one thing that they concluded after 10 years of analyzing it is that out of 40 other examples, along with the worker-driven social responsibility model and the Fair Food Program, they were unable to deliver the changes that they were supposed to be pursuing. And when you analyze the why, it's because there are no legally binding agreements. This cannot be something that corporations do voluntarily. It needs to have some seriousness to it. In the same way that they do business, they don't do business shaking hands. They do business signing agreements, committing themselves to the things that their business encompasses. They need to do the same when it comes to farm workers. Workers need to be at the center. All of those elements are part of what we have. We have a robust mechanism for auditing that audits over 50% to up to 100% of the labor force, depending on the size of these farms. Some of these farms have thousands of workers. So it's that intentionality, but also putting our efforts concentrated on delivering and having workers protected with the power of the market is what delivers these results. We will be happy to talk more with anyone who wants to learn more about this after this. But I would say, let's push for the things that have already been created. Let's work together to expand these protections. And one way to do it is boycotting Wendy's, you know? It's increasing the amount of corporations that are participating in this so that we can make out of this something that is not a rare occasion in which things went right, but something that can become the norm. That's what we want. And I think that we are able to do that if we all focus on this together.
Great, thanks, Roberto. And I'm wondering if either Nina or Bobby kind of want to talk a little bit about kind of, I know Nina, you mentioned kind of there are, you know, it's not necessarily a one size fits all approach. So in your kind of in the sort of sub informal supply chain, what do you see as, you know, successful models and how to kind of change that power dynamic? What are the levers that are available there?
Yes, thanks, Kate. I mean, I think that, you know, part of what we have to look for in different regions too is how we can organize workers and bring workers to the table. So in the informal sector, at least in the communities where we're working, you know, workers are pretty isolated. For example, if you look at the textile industries that we're in, there's when you get to the deep supply chain and the base workers, you've got predominantly women working inside the homes. For example, if you look at the Indian garment workers in the north. And so, you know, we use a model that kind of goes from the community up and the company down, and that we're working with the company applying standards, right standards throughout the supply chain from the primary factory, fully mapping the supply chain to the what we call the hidden workers, the hidden locations, to the informal workers, and ensuring those standards are being applied, but then also working within the community and building literally through household surveys with community-based facilitators, ensuring like where is the work happening, what are the terms of work, bringing that data for and organizing these communities to be able to both work on child protection, wage negotiation, access to even understanding not just what they need to make, but what is the prevalent wage that's being made outside of their communities, because usually they're making far, far less there. So, you know, there are a lot of interrelated issues that we, at least through our model, feel need to be worked on in a holistic way, and really engaging at all parts of the supply chain in doing that. So again, I mean, when I opened, really, I tried to emphasize the fact that we need to get to the full supply chain. Again, when we're talking about industries where you have manufacturing and really hidden aspects of that, that's, again, we have to get to there. And then also implementing programs where we have, we're offering remedy to those that are found in exploitation, and then addressing root causes, all of those things. So a holistic approach is needed. And when it comes to community-based programming, in our model, we also look at each, you know, we implement that differently. If we're in India or we're in Nepal, it's based on what is needed in those communities.
Great, thank you. And I know, so we're gonna move right into Q&A. There's a ton of great questions. And I think this one I'm gonna send to Bobby first. So this is kind of a combination of questions from Lauren Compare from Boston Common Asset Management and Pat Zarega from Mercy Investment Services. And so there's kind of, this question is, I've heard that many due diligence processes, you know, from many of those processes, that audits have become harder and more egregious forms of human rights, like increased child labor in the DRC in terms of cobalt, have increased over time. Are there any suggestions as to alternatives to on the ground audits? You know, any kind of coordinated action by due diligence organizations to sort of brainstorm on effective alternatives? And then Pat brought in, you know, with COVID, we hear that auditors are not really getting out into the field. So, you know, how effective can auditors be from afar, and what sort of alternatives should we be brainstorming about?
Yeah, the broader ask around meaningful worker engagement in third-party audits has been around even before the pandemic. This is something that we have flagged as an issue, that third-party audits do not necessarily allow for meaningful engagement with the very people, you know, that we claim to protect from findings of human rights abuse in supply chains. And I think that still applies during the pandemic. How is it, how can companies and the auditors that they employ work more closely with workers, whether organized workers, worker representatives? The other thing that we had been thinking about as an international labor rights movement, so to speak, or network, is how to build accountability into the third-party audit process. How do we hold them accountable for the advice that they give to companies, which more often than not have not exposed or not addressed the human rights abuses that workers themselves have been flagging. I think there's also room for, I think some of you might be surprised at how at the hesitation that worker groups that are highly organized, that are very systematic in their documentation, the hesitation that they receive from lead firms, from companies, from engagement, like how difficult it is to say, we have our documentation of COVID impacts, will you please receive them and take them and compare them with your notes? Like even at that most basic level, we've found it difficult to have real entry points around that. So I think there has to be stronger demand for direct worker engagement between brands and workers, and not just coursing information through suppliers, and B, creating a system whereby the people that they rely on for information and advice are actually accountable under law, accountable under their own due diligence measures for the information they provide and for the processes that they employ. And then on the second part, how to get around like the travel restrictions. Again, like this is where the work of workers and organizers come in. It hasn't stopped. Like the documentation by workers of the impact of COVID and the numerous abuses, it's still ongoing, except that that information, just to be completely honest, is not always welcome to the decision makers. So there just has to be room for that kind of engagement.
Thanks, Bobby. Nina, did you want to, or Gerardo, did you want to take this? I'll send it to Gerardo first.
Thanks. I would say that, you know, it is a challenge, like it is for everybody in these times of COVID. For workers, we have been, or our job has been deemed essential. We have not been treated as essential workers. And sadly, when I have to think about which kinds of pieces would need to be moving in order to be able to create an environment in which it is safe for workers and for you know, educators in this case about the Fair Food Program, to see how things are being implemented, makes it a little difficult. You know, companies can only do things to a certain point, but there's also that responsibility of the state government and the Department of Health in doing their part to protect our community so that COVID doesn't get a hold of entire crews. We're a very vulnerable population. So I think that that's something that we cannot avoid. And what we are going to be doing, we're going to be visiting the farms to do the sessions of education with workers, and we're gonna be doing this while the season in Florida is going on 8 months of the year. We're gonna find a way, but obviously we have to be absolutely careful. And the advantage of having a program with the growers and it's something that is implemented along with them, is that we can talk with them and we can craft along with them the protocols that are going to be part of what's going to be implemented through the market in the same way that the other protections are, because we, you know, nobody anticipated that there was going to be a pandemic this year, this season. And so we have to continue to do our part. We observe the social distancing, but I don't think that would be possible, or that would even matter if we were to visit workers in farms outside of the program, because first of all, we wouldn't have access. And the conditions there are horrible. And we are hearing a lot of stories of workers that are not given any kind of protection, consideration, care at all. If they get sick, they just are not taken to the fields, and they are expected to, you know, weather the illness at home while living with a lot of other people. So that cannot be the model. In our case, you know, we will continue to do our best, but yeah, it's limited. We haven't been doing the visits right now. It's the summer, workers are in other states, so it's a little bit difficult. But once we start the season here, we're gonna go back to to do our best and, you know, hope that we don't get any problems related to COVID to continue to do our work.
Great, thanks. Nina, if you want to just quickly address it, and then we'll move into one last question.
Yeah, I won't repeat what's been said, but just specifically, yes, agreed. It's a huge challenge to be able to get to the ground level, and especially to workers at the base. But two things we've been doing just practically from our standpoint. One is surveys. So we have we're in contact directly with a lot of workers on the ground. So we've been doing survey work. We're about to publish a survey across 3 industries in South Asia, where we've collected information on the conditions of workers. So it's not individual cases in every situation that we're able to address, but we're able to look at what the trends are in different regions, and therefore where we're going to see increased indebtedness, increased child labor, a range of other issues that we're going to have to go back much more intensively to work on. But also because in many of the regions where we work, we have people within the communities that are embedded into the program and the due diligence. We're getting information not just about what's happening from a worker standpoint where there actually is production happening, but where has the supply chain re-engaged, where has it not, so that we can come back to the field, which I will say our teams on the ground are pushing to do, and we're trying to be careful and not move too fast. We know where to strategically engage and not have to go everywhere. So those are some of the ways in which we're able to continue doing the work.
Great, thank you, Nina. And so I've been chatted and told we don't have time for one more question, but I'm going to go rogue and do it anyway. I'm going to give you each like 20 seconds, basically, to answer. So looking forward, there was a question around is there anything that investors are doing wrong, and asking for the wrong things. So if you could quickly just say, if you can think of anything that we're doing wrong, and then what we should be asking for in 20 seconds or less. I know that's probably impossible, but Bobby, go right ahead.
I would break it down into two tests, really. Like, is in terms of decision making, is this decision going to create economic stability among workers? So that goes into these purchasing decisions. They need to be accountable, not just by they, I mean the companies, not just for their own economic stability, but the economic stability of workers at the lowest levels of supply chains. The second is this improving workers' agency? Is this building worker power? Is this creating an enabling environment so that workers are able to assert their voice, their power, their agency? And it speaks to part of what Gerardo has said, which is, there's that level of negotiation, like basically coming up with enforceable brand agreements, but there's also the environment that's created by regulation and policy. Are they supporting policies that are enabling workers to organize, speak up, and assert power?
Great, thank you. Gerardo?
Well, for my part, I think that we could be doing a lot of things different if we start to think about the communities that are suffering, as investors. I'm not an investor, I'm a farm worker, but I think that what is lacking sometimes, it's direct communication with the communities to strategize together, but not under the assumption that somehow workers are there to be saved. This is something that we like to always remind people, because if we're talking about an issue that is related to power, if what's missing so that workers can have a dignified life is the ability for workers to be able to stand up for their rights and know that they are not going to be fired, know that they are protected against any kind of retaliation, then workers are going to be able to speak. If there's an economic incentive that improves their livelihoods, then that is also something that needs to happen. Now, none of this is gonna occur if we are in the backseat, if the conversations about these issues are not bringing us to the center, but as a driving force. We need to lead. Communities that suffer need to lead the way out of that suffering. Communities that are in positions in which power can be conceded to workers so that they can arrive to the table and negotiate for a better outcome in the work they do. That's what needs to happen. I think that investors have a lot of opportunities to be able to use their power, use their access to be able to open the door for those who need to speak a little bit louder in those spaces.
Thanks, Gerardo. And finally, Nina.
The only thing I would add now is just to say that, you know, there are a lot of, I know a lot of you personally and how much work you're doing to engage with companies, and you know, the people that you're talking to, a lot of them are well-intended, they're engaged with programs that we all know the names of, and you know, that seems satisfactory, but I think it's important to understand the real impact that any program you're pushing for is having. So not impact like this many workers have been touched, but how, what kind of change is happening due to whatever solution you're pushing for, whether it's anything we're working on or beyond. And it takes a lot of work on your part. I mean, obviously feel free to call on us. There are other good organizations out there, but it's really critical to know what is happening as a result. So, you know, is child labor reducing because of this engagement? Are workers at the table? You know, these kinds of things. It has to be that concrete. We can't go forward taking impact in terms of these many lives touched. It has to be specific and deep and change oriented.
Great. Thank you so much, Nina. And I think I flew too close to the sun with the whole timing thing, but please join me in thanking Bobby and Gerardo and Nina for their time and for sharing their expertise with us. And just before you go, I know it's 2:01, just a few brief announcements. You won't want to miss tomorrow's worker-driven social responsibility session. That's tomorrow at 11 a.m. That session will go more into depth into the worker-driven essentially model for change. And also wanted to just flag the human trafficking and worker rights call, which is on the 2021 action plan. And that's on October 13th from 2 to 3. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you so much to David Schilling for organizing it, and John for organizing the back office, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Safe.
your time.
Bobby, Nina, and Gerardo.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
We'll
Kate.
continue to fight together.
Good to be with you all.